Hello, everybody. David Brennan here from the Castle Bookshop, Castlebar and mayobooks.ie. I'd like to welcome you all to what is now our third podcast. And we've been delighted with the feedback, all the positive comments that we've got from those of you that have tuned in to the first two. So thank you very, very much for your feedback. It's greatly appreciated. It's my pleasure to welcome on this third podcast, Máirtín O'Halloran, who has wrote a fantastic book called The Lost Gaeltacht. It tells the story of the Land Commission migration from Clogher, County Galway, to Allenstown, County Meath. Now, I've literally taken what it says on the tin there by reading that out. That's the introduction on the book. But it's an absolutely fantastic book, really enjoyable, really informative. It tells you the history of the migration in terms of the actual factual history, but it also gives you a huge insight into the social history, the stories of the people themselves that were uprooted from their home in Clogher and moved to Allenstown, County Meath. And Máirtín has, I suppose, Máirtín, I'm probably right in saying this, that as a child of the migrants, Máirtín has first-hand experience and probably heard these stories firsthand growing up. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Máirtín to the podcast, and let's have a chat about your wonderful book.
Well, Guru Mila, my health. I thank you very much, David. Yeah, I look forward to it. I think, as you said, yes, I heard these stories from literally, I could, I suppose, walk, and I didn't, you're not aware of the difference of your experience. You think everyone is having the same growing up experience, but it was a little bit different in County Meath. Irish was the language of the household. I was child number 8 of 10. So the community spoke Irish, and as we ran in and out of each other's houses, Irish was what was spoken. So I heard the stories around my own house, but I also heard them in other houses. And then when I got to be about 10, my father took me to what I call the ancestral and spiritual homeland, and I was smitten for the rest of my life, I think,
Very good. Well, it's a beautiful part of the world, in fairness now. A beautiful part of the world. So I guess how we might start is, let's discuss how you decided to write the book. Kind of, I guess your inspiration for it is pretty obvious, being a child of migrants, but maybe let's talk us through that whole process, what you unearthed in the process. I think that could be very interesting to investigate.
I think really where this started for me was when my children were in school and they were asked by the teacher to do a little project on their own families and their ancestors. And of course, they came home and asked me, and I was quite humbled and shocked at my ignorance. And I said, I better do something about this. So I really started the quest about 20 years ago of family history research. And of course, it's become highly fashionable now with DNA and all the tools we have available. But from there, I became interested in the community, and in particular, how a community of 24 families or 127 people were literally transplanted on the 29th of March. And what I asked people, there was a lot of uncertainty. People said, oh, well, we know it was 1940 and we know it was the spring. And I was somewhat uncomfortable with this uncertainty. So I said, I better really start writing it down. So I collected, like a lot of people, a box of yellow sticky labels and envelopes and scraps of paper. And then when I retired from my day job in the Health and Safety Authority in 2018, I said, I better really scratch this itch. And I started writing. And I had a lot of the research done, but I'd say it was disordered and it was a matter of trying to pull it together. And I wanted to write something that would be available as a reference. So I was conscious that I needed to authenticate and reference all my sources, but I didn't want an academic tome. I wanted something to be accessible, a little bit chitty chatty, a little bit social history about the lives of people. So that's why I gathered up their stories, their customs. I interviewed well over 100 people. Sadly, many of those are lost to us now. So I'm glad I got their insights and thoughts while we still had them. And it was interesting then to cross-reference their memories against the hard facts of as recorded in the Land Commission files, as recorded in newspapers, as recorded in a range of different sources, births, marriages, deaths. And what emerged was, for me, quite fascinating. It was you know, the poverty of the area. I mean, it was one of the most congested areas along the western seaboard. It was absolutely beautiful, but very, very poor. They were living, as they'd say, on top of each other.
And that's what actually really surprised me initially when going through the book, that, and maybe we might get into this in more detail later on, but even though it was so hard, and it must have been such an emotional wrench to be taken from your home place like that and moved to the other side of the country, which in 1940 was, you know, you were moved. It was a very long journey to go back to visit or whatever. Kind of, would it be fair to say that they were able to create a better life for themselves?
They were, and I think that was the big attraction. I suppose really it was very poor, but they loved their culture, they loved their language, they loved their Caeling. But the probably biggest testament is that men and women who were already in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s were willing to make this move, knowing they would never ever see their homeland again, and that they would end up being buried, to use the expression, in a different land. But that was what they wanted to do for their family. They wanted to break that vicious cycle of emigration. I mean, each one of these families had probably 10, 12 or more children, and only one or two remained in Ireland. The vast majority emigrated to the US, some to the UK, but predominantly from this area to Pennsylvania and Ohio, which was, of course, then the industrial heartland of America, now called the Rust Belt, and re-emerging and reinventing itself as the high-tech center of the US. But, you know, that was the reality in the late 1800s up into the 1900s.
Okay, and they weren't going over to an easy life either over there. It was coal mining and a lot of that sort of stuff, wasn't it?
It was coal. They went there for the coal mining and the steel industry. Pennsylvania had a lot of coal mines, and Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, had some very famous steel industries. And I found a lot of the people that were leaving Clonbur and the environs going to Pennsylvania and Ohio, and they worked really hard. They died down the mines. They died young of respiratory conditions. They died of conditions that are very curable now. In fact, a very well-known poet from Clogher, he's known to a lot of people as Michael Luke Fágin, but he's Michael Kine, was a case in point. Here's a very accomplished poet, but because of poverty, he ended up in Pennsylvania, died in 1916, sadly a young man from a respiratory condition due to his work in the mines. So that was the fate of many of them. Very hard work. Children killed in mines, you know, while still quite young. But it's interesting to note their progression, which I don't cover this to any great degree in the book. It'll be in one of my next books, but you know, by the next generation, they were entering the military, entering the police, the fire services. So socially, the next generation were progressing up the social ladder, and by two generations, they were entering the professions.
Running the show. Well, I think in fairness, I think we as Irish, we seem to have that ability to move up through the ranks when we emigrate quite quickly. Yes. So that's
and while that's the case of the immigrants who went to the US, I think the liberation of many people who went to Allenstown was through education. They valued education, and while other children locally in the school might be allowed out of school when they were 13 or 14, the migrants tended to insist their children went to school until they were 16 or 17, able to get a trade or into the bank or the public service or whatever. But they wanted to break this pernicious and vicious cycle of emigration, and really that happened. And any children who migrated or emigrated did so because of the excitement and the desire to see the world. And I did a comparative analysis you know, among the generations, and it really did break that cycle of emigration.
Okay. I guess I'd like to kind of I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning, the
Yes.
point. Well, maybe not the beginning, but the point where people are leaving Clogher for Allenstown. And your book, you know, it discusses. First of all, I suppose the cover of the book, which I'll hold up here. There's a photograph of people going on into the buses in Clogher. Your book deals with, you know, I guess people packing up their possessions, heading off to the other side of the country. I guess, could you talk me through, even as a migrant yourself, how you felt about discussing this process, and I suppose what you unearthed when you did your research?
Yeah, in fact, probably the most pithy expression I heard was from my mother's first cousin, Tommy Mannion. And he said he recalled his father saying, there were strong men kissing stone walls in tears.
Yes, yeah, that's in the book, yes.
And it was a strangely emotional thing to sort of imagine these men who were not normally what I call emotional or tactile. They were probably emotional, but they were certainly not of an era when they were tactile. But here was a very human experience for them. But yes, it was probably the greatest American wake that ever took place in Clogher, where literally, you know, people were weeping, they were crying, there was excitement. The children had never seen a bus, they were boisterous, they wanted to get on the bus. And I mean, people like Tommy, who sadly passed just a few years ago at a fine age, had a personal living memory of it. And I was able to interview quite a few people with that actual living memory. Not only the living memory of the migration and the settling, but a living memory of how they lived before migration. And one of my next door neighbors, Mark Kerrigan, recounts how, you know, big families literally were cramped into tiny little houses, 2 rooms, sometimes 3 rooms if they were lucky. And he said that there could be 3 beds in the room with a number of people crowded into every bed. So it gives a stark observation of just how small the houses were. Now, as it turns out, some of the houses were, in the scheme of things, considered reasonably okay because they had stone walls and thatched roofs. But they were moving to County Meath, they were getting 3-room, well, actually 4-room houses. You know, this was sort of like doubling or more their available space. They were getting a shed for their cows, their horse, their pigs, their hens, you know. So yes, it was a very emotional time, and there were more families. And in fact, the Land Commission inspector's report about this says that they have enough families, but even if some people fall out, they still have enough of people on the list waiting to join the queue. And every family who wished to apply actually applied to the Land Commission inspector. He, as it turns out, interviewed each family, and the criteria were that they had to have experience of farming, they had to have Irish as their language, because the Land Commission had been doing its work since 1890, as indeed had the Congested Districts Board since 1881 for the Land Commission, 1891 for the Congested Districts Board. But after De Valera's government came into power in 1932, the Gaelic revival was emerging, and the Mulcahy report in 1925 demonstrated the language was in decline. So here was an opportunity to combine the notion of revitalizing the language with the migration. So this happened after 1932 when De Valera's government swept into power. So there were a number of Gaeltacht colonies established. Obviously, the best known is Rathcarn, 1935, Ballyib, 1937, Clongill, Kilbride, 1939, and then number 5, Allenstown or Bala Alien, 1940. But of course, the language did not survive there as well. But even in my time, I was born in 56, dare I say, So my memory was 20 years on from the event, and Irish was still alive and active,
Okay,
spoken
okay.
as the language of the household.
I guess it was a noble objective and probably, yeah, maybe not super realistic with the benefit of hindsight, from the point of view of regenerating Irish, but certainly, from the point of view of improving people's lives, it seems that it was, very successful.
I
Like your
think
book.
I think what I probably should have mentioned is that not only were they leaving a very poor area, but it was an era of landlordism, and while, and I don't want to be critical, the Guinnesses were considered to be fine philanthropists, and that, I mean, there was another darker side to the Guinness dynasty as experienced by many of the tenants in Clogher, who were tenants of Lord Ardilaun and the Guinness. I mean, they were good employers, but it's not all a single-sided story. There was a darker side, and for instance, children were prosecuted in the courts for pulling a bit of heather on Shannon Mountain just to boil the few potatoes.
Okay.
1921 was known as Blian na Sup, the year of the wisps, because literally they weren't able to save turf. So very poor economic circumstances.
Yes, yeah, and I guess history does show that, the landlords, by their very nature, I think it's fair enough to say, oppressed and made life very difficult for their tenants in certain circumstances. And certainly moving over to Allenstown, people seem to be afforded a lot more freedom, a lot more liberty, and I suppose a chance to make their own lives.
Yeah, it's very interesting to compare, and I don't have an easy answer for this, but when I look at the behaviors of some of the landlords along the western seaboard and a much more benign regime in the Midlands and the East, for instance, the land they settled on was the estate of Vice Admiral Arthur William Craig Waller. He was a man of some personal accomplishment. He was originally from Tullamore, but rose to the level of Vice Admiral in the British Navy and captained a ship in the HMS Barham in the Battle of Jutland. Now, he returned to live on that estate, but his relationship with his tenants was much, much more positive. And, I was able, with the support of some people in Bohermeen and the Craig Waller descendants, they shared photographs and various artifacts from their family papers. And from that, one got a very, very different insight into the relationship between landlord and tenant. And there in County Meath, it was a much more benign, they were photographed with their tenants. Their tenants had, they had fine pedigree cattle, so a very different relationship. But anyway, in 1937, the land was acquired by the Land Commission, and then started a period of a number of years of agitation. And I suppose it was very loud, and it's redolent of some of the protests we see today about international and inward migration. But here it was migration from one part of the country to the other. And literally, I illustrated with an advert from the Meath Chronicle, which says, "No more migrants for Meath land for the Meath men."
Yeah.
And really, there were slogans painted on rooftops and roads: "Migrants not welcome," and open letters written to the migrants and published in newspapers, syndicated newspapers up and down the country, saying they're not welcome. And it's interesting to notice that while this was a program being progressed and advanced by the De Valera government, it was creating tensions at local level, because the local Fianna Fáil Common, while accepting the broad thrust of it, was also experiencing pressure and lobbying from locals that the migrants were not welcome. So there was this friction created, but thankfully when they did arrive, their experience was different, and some local families were quick to hold out the hand of friendship. I'll mention the Piggott family Charlie Pickett was often mentioned by people as being one of the first men in the area to what I say, hold out the hand of friendship, shake hands, and welcome people into their house. And it's interesting. And while we tend to be slightly uncomfortable now, it was a different era in terms of religious divide. And Charlie was of the Protestant faith, but yet he was, at a time when the church held very powerful sway, he was the man who initiated this. Now, there was a skirmish which, you know, I wouldn't be able to write the book if I didn't have a few skirmishes. So luckily, you know, young men from the West met young men from the East, and they both laid claim to a football pitch with, I say, pitchforks and sticks and allegedly the odd gun hidden, and they laid into each other, and the subsequent court case ran for about a year and a half. I have to confess that one of my own uncles and my cousins and other neighbors were in the middle of it, but you know, that's the way it was.
That's probably sure. It's still going on in a smaller level, but fights outside a nightclub, maybe.
Yeah, ironically, about a year later, there was another skirmish at a dance hall. By now, the young men and young women, East and West, were getting friendly. And when the judge asked some of the witnesses about the incident, some of the locals said, "Your Honor, I didn't see anything." So very quickly, relationships were building, and the young men from the West were finding, and indeed women were finding, employment. So already within a year, there was what I call the social engagement and the mixing, and sometimes there was, you know, a bit of fisticuffs, and sometimes there was a bit of loving going on.
Yeah, well, that's I suppose that's all human nature, history repeating itself, sure. Yeah. So your book discusses actually when the migrants arrived to Allenstown, that they were welcomed by other migrants that had come from Donegal or other parts of Mayo. And I wonder, there was obviously a sense of community, and obviously they could empathize with one another, and understand one another's experience. I wonder, has that community continued to this day, or have those kind of links been maintained?
To some degree, yes. And I think, you know, some of the locals from Gibbstown who moved 3 years earlier were aware of it. And I suppose people nowadays have no concept of communications limitations. I mean, we have online and social media. Back then, they had a letter in the post, or if something was urgent, they sent a telegram if they could afford to send a telegram, because you paid by the letter in the telegram. So, you know, telegrams were most usually sent to advise that a person has died, and it would be, "Jim died, funeral tomorrow." Literally, they were sparing with their words. But on this occasion, there were telegrams sent to say when the people were arriving, and some of the people from Gibbstown traveled on their bikes, which it's only distance about 5 miles or so, or to those thinking nowadays about 8 kilometers. But to light the fires and have the houses warm for them, and that friendship did continue for certainly for the lifetime of that generation, and it did continue friendships into the next generation.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's fair to say, and I was aware that, you know, I suppose it's fair to say, a lot of hostility in some quarters to people moving into County Meath, and maybe to a certain extent that was understandable. You know, maybe it wasn't played out as honorably as it could have been. But I did know that your book mentioned that, you know, some of the fields were ploughed in advance, so they were ready to go, and, you know, they were, maybe that was done on a government level, but I guess it probably wasn't all bad either, you know. And I was kind of heartened to read of the welcome that the migrants had received, because I had a kind of image in my head that it was all doom and gloom, to be honest with you, before I read the book.
No, it wasn't all doom and gloom. I say there was a lot of noise and bluster and agitation and political lobbying beforehand, but what I call the real lived experience of the people was that they bonded actually quite well. Now, there were some residual enmities that people continued. But that was, to my mind, in the minority, and you know, you just move on, and it really is a story of triumph and success against some difficult challenges. I mean, the other thing to bear in mind is that this took place during World War II, or as we locally call it, the emergency, you know?
Emergency, yeah.
So, you know, they immediately had compulsory tillage. They had to put stakes in the big fields to stop German invasions in case bombers. But my father used to tell a story about how he had to put big poles into his biggest field because it was considered big enough for small aircraft to land. So he had to render it as a field where a small aircraft couldn't land. So we wouldn't be invaded, Ireland wouldn't be invaded through Allenstown, you know. But they had the compulsory tillage. But yeah, they had a bit of land ploughed for them. They got a horse. They got implements. They got £1 a week for the first year to help them build fences.
Yes.
Now, there were some very interesting stories about what I call Pat King's bad horse. You know, there were funny little moments in it as well. Not funny to the people at the time, but he got a bad horse. And the Land Commission were refusing to accept that this was a bad horse, but he got a very eminent veterinary surgeon in Kells, Mr. Kelly, to assess the horse. Now, this was a man well experienced in dealing with some of the best equine flesh in County Meath, and he attested that this was a bad horse. So I found some really interesting letters on the Land Commission files, which, you know, sadly are not available, but I'll put in a little plug. I think it's probably one of the single richest untapped repositories of sociology, economics, history, genealogy in this country, amounting to about 11 million pages. So it's vast and so rich. It would be wonderful to see it digitized, archived, and made available. You know, it would bring an economic boost to Ireland by researchers. You know.
Well, if that does happen, Marshall, you can take some credit for it now with that plug.
Well, I'd like to think that such a valuable, amazing resource would be available to scholars and academics, and indeed what I call ordinary punters like myself.
I'm sure down the road. Now, Martin, to round off, I suppose it's often commented that history tends to repeat itself, and obviously, I suppose in the world of today, migration and immigration is constant. People are moving either through choice or by obligation. And I guess I may be putting you a small bit on the spot here, but having, I suppose, lived firsthand with a full community that migrated, what would your take be on the migration and immigration of the world today? And maybe I might zone in a little bit more on how we in Ireland are dealing with it. Do you think is Allenstown, is there a danger that it's repeating itself? I know that there are certain amounts of protests. I know there was one in County Mayo last year. I guess I'd just be interested on your take, given your own personal experience on it.
I think, sadly, a lot of the behaviours that are unfortunate are driven often by fear. And I think possibly at national and government level, there probably needs to be quite a bit of work done to remove some of the fear, but also engaging in consultation. And I see the same themes emerging with inward migration into Ireland, as I saw with an internal migration within Ireland in the 1940s, you know, fear, hostility, and yet a warmness and a welcomeness when actually people get into the local communities. And I've seen that. So sometimes you can get a rather vocal minority articulating a view which they believe to be more widespread. And I've seen communities in Ireland which have been very welcoming to inward migrants. The other thing, and I say this is somewhat anecdotal, but once again, the inward migrants to Ireland from Asia, Africa, wherever, they are trying to seek their liberation and their progression through education. And I was talking to a cousin who is a senior person in the educational system, and he was remarking to me that some of the best students in many of our second level schools now are among the migrant communities, because they're hungry to achieve success and break out of their historic pattern. And we saw this in Allenstown, where the migrants had an appetite. So I suppose really, it really is history repeating itself, same
Yeah,
themes. But I think
yeah.
the lessons we should learn is consultation, engagement, and try and remove the fears. And the local communities very often will do the right thing.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you, Martin. And I think on that note, it's a perfect note to wrap up. Thank you very much to Martin for joining us today. I really enjoyed that conversation, and I hope you, the listener, have too. The book, again, I give it a plug. It's called The Lost Gaeltacht, and it's available to purchase in the Castle Bookshop, Castlebar, and online at www.mayobooks.ie. Thank you very much, and take care.
Gur míle mai help.